I never really believed in the paranormal or supernatural. I always thought the stories about people being haunted or possessed were just stories made up for entertainment, or cases of severely mentally ill patients being misunderstood by fanatical priests claiming demonic possession. I never suspected that they were actually real. But when I was 13, my naive brain would be put in its place. It was the summer of 2007. Life was good. I had a pretty normal teenage life. I had a few friends my age who lived in the same neighborhood as me, and we would do a lot of outdoor activities like hiking, mountain biking, and fishing. We lived just north of the Ozark Mountains in a nice little town in Arkansas. My father had worked very hard to give us all a good life. He came from a poor family and joined the military at 18 to better his future, and it paid off. He got a good job working on airplanes, and we moved to the country. My parents got a steal on a really nice old house in the village. It was a nice little community built into the woods, which had golf courses, private lakes and trails, and its own shopping center with a harps and a couple of restaurants. We were a happy, normal middle-class family. That is, until that thing showed up and ruined our lives. There were a lot of local legends about the natives that used to inhabit the area. Supposedly, our entire community was built on top of sacred land. I used to walk the trails near my house a lot, and you could find cliffs and overhangs with Indian paintings on the walls and remnants of their civilization. I always felt bad about how they were driven from their homes by my ancestors, but I was still grateful for my home and wonderful life. The kids at school would often scare each other by telling tales of shamans summoning skinwalkers and rakes, and that to this day they still haunt the woods at night, looking for a midnight snack. I always laughed it off. Ghosts and monsters aren't real. They're just made up stories to scare kids. I always thought the ghost hunter shows were ridiculous. You wouldn't hear or see anything on camera, but the people in the show would jump at a creek in the night, and suspenseful music would play while the camera focused on empty darkness. Those shows can be fun for the imagination, but the reality of paranormal entities is much more terrifying. They can tear apart families and bring your whole world crashing down. I would learn this dark reality one summer night. The air was cool. I had my window open and could hear the wind flowing through the leaves. The cicadas reverberating through the midnight woods put me in a sleepy trance. I relaxed and drifted off to sleep. In such a beautiful place, I was completely safe. I always felt one with the woods. It really is beautiful here. Cradled in the sounds of nature, I drifted deep into sleep. Then, a wave of panic. I feel every hair stand up, chills down my spine. I feel the eyes of someone on me. I can feel their sinister intent. Every fiber in me is telling me to run. There's something here that wants to kill me. No, worse, it wants to own me, to see me suffer. It has been watching me for a long time. I have been chosen. I can't breathe. Help me. Help me, I scream. Mom! I hear laughter. Not human. Not a physical voice. Multiple voices of all octaves laughing at once. I can't open my eyes. I can't breathe or talk, but I see its eyes. Blue, bloodshot, bulging eyes. Huge pupils. Red is filling my mind. I feel pressure. My entire body is vibrating and I feel like I'm going to explode. I gasp as I fully awaken. But as I open my eyes, I freeze. I can't believe what I'm seeing. Through my open door, I can see something laying on our living room couch. It's clearly visible, but clearly not a person. It's like a shadow, but flowing. The moonlight illuminates its face, a skull with a sinister smile. It has those same eyes from my dream. Huge, bulging, wide-open eyes. Crystal blue pupils. It's staring at me, smiling. It's awkwardly sprawled out on the couch and its shadowy body like a translucent but pitch black cloak flows as if underwater. I'm getting chills just typing this. And I want to be clear that this is not a fictional story. This really happened. I was so scared I was frozen. I felt electricity going up and down my spine, through my brain. My eyes were wide and watering. My mouth hung open. It stared into my eyes, into my mind for what felt like hours. It then quickly shifted out of sight. It darted down the couch and into the shadows. Adrenaline hit me and I ran into my parents' room. I burst open the door panting and covered in sweat. My parents were at first annoyed, and it was the typical things parents do when something like this happens, but as I described every detail about my encounter and when they saw how terrified I was, I started to see a look of unease and fear in my father's eyes. He was scared. He believed me. My father, being a devout Christian, believed in demons, and he was convinced I had just been tormented and that I was in danger. He was very serious, and I could see that he was disturbed by what had just happened. He woke up my little sister, and the whole family gathered in the living room. I wish my dad had never done what he did next. He got out his Bible and turned the pages to a verse. I don't quite remember the actual verse, but it was something about casting out demons. "In the name of Jesus Christ, I command you to leave my family alone," he yelled angrily, cursing the demon. "If you want one of us, take me. Leave my family alone." We sat in the living room talking well into the night, and after a while we were all tired and went back to bed. I couldn't sleep though. I couldn't forget those eyes, its evil smile, the way it moved. It was disturbing. Fast forward a few months and things were normal. Me and my sister went back to school, and for the most part I had forgotten all about the demon. I even convinced myself it was a bad dream, or even sleep paralysis, even though that was the only time sleep paralysis had ever happened to me. I went on with my life, until we got the worst news I had ever heard to this day. My dad was diagnosed with a rare form of bone cancer, and it had spread. He was dying. We were devastated. I hugged my father and cried all day that day. I couldn't believe I was going to lose my dad. He was always so strong and seemed very healthy. The weird thing is, and the doctors were also puzzled, his cancer was usually only found in teenagers. It was a cancer that almost 100% of the time was only found in boys in their early teens. This shocked me and made me feel guilty. The whole experience of the demon became prominent in my mind, and I remembered my father's words to the demon. I think it had its eyes on me, but it went after my dad instead. I wish it had taken me though. My family would be much better off today if it had. My father remained positive through his sickness. He went to chemotherapy sessions, started eating healthier, and worked out about as much as he could. With his bald head and amputated leg, people would often come up to him and thank him for his service. He always laughed and said, "Thank you," because he was a veteran. However, contrary to what people thought, his condition was much worse than if he had stepped on an IED. He lived for 3 more years, even though the doctors said he had less than a year to live. He always stayed happy and positive, more for our sake than his own. But towards the end, he started to slowly deteriorate. It was awful. I couldn't do anything to help him. The man I looked up to, who protected us, who I always saw as invincible, was crumbling before me. He lost all his weight and started sleeping on the couch to not disturb my mom. He was so sick. He suffered so much. I would hear his death rattles and moans and want nothing more than to help him in any way I could. Something that disturbs me so much to this day is that I started to realize something. He more and more resembled the demon. He was getting so thin he looked like a skeleton, and he had very blue eyes. Sometimes he would just look at me from the couch and I would get chills. The demon had been mocking me, imitating what he would do to my father while viciously smiling, as if it was funny. This enrages me. How can something be so vile, so purely evil? My poor father soon died and left us a broken family. My mother fell into a deep depression. I looked after my little sister, tried to be the best father figure I could be, even though I was a poor substitute. We fell behind on the bills and the bank foreclosed our house. We lost everything. The next handful of years were a struggle, but now I'm an adult and have gotten some sort of a stable life. I recently figured out why my father was so shaken that night and didn't just blow it off as a bad dream. I visited my sister recently and we started talking about ghosts and the paranormal. I asked if she had ever seen anything like that and she hesitated for a second but then told me. And what she said gave me the chills. She was very young the night I saw the demon and had largely forgotten that night. But she told me she used to see a shadowy man standing at the end of her bed. He had a skull for a face. Demons are real. The story happened in October of 2004, back when I was still a third-year high school student. My friends and I stuck around the school late at night after our annual Halloween party. We had agreed to try out my friend's Ouija board. It wasn't the brightest idea, but we needed a thrill. We found a nice spot under a huge gnarl tree and proceeded with our half-put-together ritual. There were 5 of us, 2 boys and 3 girls. We were all expecting some kind of paranormal contact. Rumors had it our school was haunted, but we've never really experienced anything firsthand, and it was Halloween when all the spirits came out to play. We all wanted to get spooked. Also, we've never seen a Ouija board firsthand before, so we were pretty excited. Our school was an old Spanish colonial house, built in the 1800s when the Spaniards still occupied the Philippines. We were in a section of the school that doesn't get used often, located beside a creepy old Jesuit house. People only go there when they needed to use the restroom, store equipment on one of the sheds, or make out with their boyfriends or girlfriends. We sat down in the middle of an open space, with only an exposed bare bulb nearby illuminating the surroundings. We were all having a laugh, scaring each other with what-if scenarios. It was your typical dumb kids doing dumb things. My friend who brought the Ouija board proceeded to place it in the middle of our circle. If I remember correctly, it was the glow-in-the-dark version, which we found hilarious, but it gave us the ability to see what was written in the dark. Not knowing what to do and going after what we've seen in movies, we all proceeded to place our index finger on top of the planchet. We sat there looking at each other until one of us said, "What's next?" We didn't know if there was a proper way to start the ritual, plus the board didn't come with instructions, so we decided to just throw in a question. "Is anyone there?" I called out into the darkness. "If there are spirits living here, please talk to us," one of the girls joined in. We clearly had no idea what we were doing. Still, nothing. Not even the slightest bit of wind. One of my friends jerked the planchet and the girl who brought the Ouija board screamed, breaking the silence. We all laughed at how ridiculous it was. After a bit of joking around, we decided to give it another go. We all placed our index fingers on the board once more and asked, "If there's anyone there, we would like to make contact." "Don't break the circle," one of the friends said jokingly. "Shut up," I whispered. We were just about ready to give up when the wind started to pick up. The stillness broke, and the darkness around us seemed to move. Just a coincidence, we thought. "Okay, don't break the circle," I yelled out. "Is anyone there?" I was excited. It was like a scene from a movie with dirt and dead leaves swirling around us. "Guys, I'm scared," my friend sitting beside me said. "My mom warned me about playing with forces we don't know. Did you die here? Were you killed during the war? Are you the headless priest that roams these halls? Do you know Jose Rizzo, our national hero? Are you a hottie?" My friend giggled. At this point, we were all throwing random stupid questions. Nothing. "This is crap. I don't want to do this anymore," my friend said, exasperated. We were all thinking the same. Just then, a group of dogs from the neighboring house started barking at us through the chain-link fence. These 6 dogs were growling and showing teeth. We all screamed and, without finishing the ritual, bolted right out of there. We didn't see each other until after Halloween break, and this is where the story gets creepy. One of the girls told us about a weird experience she had the night after playing with the Ouija board. She had gotten home late after hanging out with her friends from the neighborhood when she realized she forgot the keys to her house. So she called her brother up, who was then still sharing a room with her, and what he said crept the crap out of me and her. He swore she was already home. He claimed to have seen her walk in a while ago, and that she looked really tired and saw her straight to bed. Creepy, but no need to freak ourselves out, was all we thought. Besides, her brother must have just been tired and seeing things, but then my other friend started telling us about an encounter she had that Halloween night. She was going up to her room when the light started flickering as she was ascending the staircase. Your typical horror movie visuals, shrug it off to faulty wiring. But just then she saw the door to her room open, and a dark figure stepped out and stood atop of their staircase. She couldn't make out the entity's face, but she recounted that she couldn't move and felt utter dread as the figure stared down at her. "No way," my best friend who just joined in the conversation said in disbelief. Something happened to me as well. He recalled that he was sleeping one night when he woke up feeling really uncomfortable. He described his vision as having TV-like static, and a feeling of heaviness surrounded him. He looked around the room, and that's when he saw a bloody, charred face with piercing red eyes grinning at him through the window. I couldn't believe what I was hearing because I had an almost run-in with death that night. After the ritual, I was sleeping in our sedan on the way home after fooling around with the Ouija board when I felt our car jerk. I woke up instantly. Looking out the window, I found out that we'd been hit by a huge oil tanker. I panicked and leaped out of the car. Luckily, my mom and I survived the crash since the front of the car was a total wreck. I still don't have an explanation why those things happened to us, but thank God nothing happened after that. I never played or gotten near a Ouija board ever since. In Mexican folklore, an archetypical witch is the lechuza or owl witch. It is said as lechuza makes a pact with Satan or other evil spirits in order to gain this ability. They are often portrayed as older women, and it is said he removes their legs and hides them while they are in their owl form. As a child, I was told legends by my maternal grandmother, who swore encounters with witches. Luckily, I wouldn't have any encounters until my adulthood 2 years ago. I was in Mexico in my dad's hometown, a small town of maybe 9,000. Our house in Mexico is a fair bit away from the main town, at the very end of a very long dirt road. To the left of the road is small traditional houses, and to the right is a deep gully or trench, which was once a river, and on the other side of the gully is woods. It was around the time of the town's festival, which was an excuse for the adults to get drunk in the town's plaza while the kids played at the fair. I opted on leaving early as I was tired and didn't feel like drinking. I hitched a ride with someone from town who lived at the beginning of the dirt road, which meant I'd have to walk about a mile. It was close enough. 10 minutes into my walk, I heard what sounded like birds and assumed the birds nearby in the trees were settling down for the night. I looked at the trees, and about 10 feet up, I saw a pair of bright orange eyes, staring down at me. I was unnerved, but pushed on and ignored it. I heard more rustling and looked back, noticing the eyes had gone, which led me to believe that the bird had flown away, when suddenly I heard a voice from the bottom of the gully. "Hey sir, come here." I decided to ignore it, but it kept on pestering me until I snapped and walked towards the gully to tell this woman to leave me alone. I started telling her that I was in a rush to get home when I noticed something weird. She was dressed in native attire, which meant she had a long skirt, but it wasn't all the way down. The woman's ankles were missing, and she appeared to be floating. She looked at me with utter hatred in her eyes. I realized she knew that her secret was out, and I bolted for the house, hearing as a large flapping sound followed me. I looked back, and flying behind me was a huge owl with bright orange eyes. I ran into the house, but I only had a few seconds of peace before something was banging on the door, screeching inhumanly. I panicked and remembered my grandmother telling me a prayer was the best defense against a witch, which I started doing, which seemingly worked as the screaming had stopped. I decided to place salt in the doorways when something broke the kitchen window above the sink. Attempting to come through the window was that same owl, but this time it was gargling vaguely human words. In a panic, I took the salt I was using on the doorways and threw it at her. Immediately, it backed away from the window and perched itself on the fence, staring daggers into the window. I sat on the couch on edge all night and eventually passed out. The next morning, I woke up hoping it was all a horrible dream, but upon entering the kitchen, saw the glass from the broken window, and when I stepped outside, I saw large scratches on the front door. I walked over to the fence where this owl was perched, and on the fence and the floor surrounding it was blood. Unnerved, I started sweeping the glass out the front door when I saw her, an older native woman across the gully, among the trees staring at me. Her face was covered with small cuts as if she had been assaulted by tiny shards of glass. I knew this was her, and I stared her back down until eventually she retreated into the trees, and I never saw her again, thankfully. Every time I go back, I still place salt in the doorways and pray as soon as I enter the house. Often in that house, I feel watched, and other people who stay report voices outside, and knowing on the roof, I know she sits in the trees waiting until she can attack me again. I was 20 years old. I'd left home when I was 16 years old and decided to explore the world and see what I could find. I've been in Texas and Louisiana most of my life. I had been raised in Louisiana for the most part. I went from Missouri to New York, California, anywhere in the United States I could have finally decided to go. So I decided to go home. Well, up until then, I'd been staying in Oklahoma when I received a phone call from my mom saying that she might be dying from cancer. I came to find out later that she actually wasn't. She just wanted me home. I was hitchhiking through Oklahoma. It was near the Chickasaw National Park. In 2 days, I hadn't been able to catch a ride, sticking out my thumb doing all that, and no one stopped. So I said, oh well, and pitched a tent in the national park. I decided to explore more, and I followed the paved road until I got to the camping area. There was a fire pit off a little ways from the road, and it was a clear area. There were picnic tables, so I decided that's where I was going to camp that night. I decided to explore a little bit and followed a deer trail into the woods. As I was walking, I looked to my left on the ground, and there was a hawk laying there with no head, as if it had been burned off. An eerie feeling came over me, but I just brushed it away as me being paranoid. I already had some paranormal experiences, but never came across one where it involved animals. So I walked away and went back to the area that I had decided to pitch my tent that night. I sat there until it started getting dark, and I set up my tent. I left the tent flap open because it was a very cool afternoon. Finally, night came. The street lamps that were along the paved road came on. The lights were actually good enough to where I could actually read a book. At that time, I was reading Anne Rice, Queen of the Damned. As the time went on, I started to get sleepy. I reached up to zip up my tent flap and looked over at the street light that was directly in front of my tent. Standing there, directly under the street light, was a creature as tall as the street light. Well, maybe not as tall, but maybe a couple inches directly beneath it. Its hair was very, very long. It looked a little hunched. I couldn't see any eyes, because the hair seemed to be there in front of its face. It was all in black as far as I could tell, but what little skin seemed to stick out was as white as chalk, and what little bit of skin I could see was its hands, which clearly went past its knees. The hands were just hanging there. Its nails were black, very black, so dark it seemed to absorb the light. It just stood there, and it seemed as if the air surrounding it was vibrating. There was a type of static, it seemed like, in the air. Now don't get me wrong, I was very startled and afraid. I didn't know what this was. Then suddenly, underneath the hair, I could see white start to show, and it was as if the creature was smiling at me. It stood there for a very long time. Finally, as I was looking at it, something came over me. Now you may not believe me. You might say the story isn't true, but I know that it happened. I know that it happened to me. I grew angry. I grew very angry. I felt a rage inside me, and it grew very strong. I stared the creature down. I got out of my tent, stood up, and I looked straight at it and said, "I'm not afraid of you. You have no power over me." It seemed to make the creature laugh, and all that did was make me even more angry. I stood my ground, and again told it, "I am not afraid of you. You have no power over me." I stood there staring at it for what seemed like the longest time, white hot rage growing inside me, when all of a sudden I heard a loud snap behind me. I turned around quick to find out what the noise was. There was nothing there. And then a thought suddenly occurred that thing's probably behind me now. I turned around quick again and looked towards the street lamp, and it was no longer there. I bundled up in my sleeping bag after it disappeared. That night as I slept, I had a horrible nightmare of the creature standing over me, laughing with a toothy grin. The next morning I packed up my stuff and looked towards the streetlight where the thing had been standing. There was blood on the street lamp pole. I no longer had the anger that I had felt. I was very scared. So I gathered up all my stuff and got out of there as quick as I could. I headed to the highway, stuck up my thumb, and thankfully someone picked me up. I have never been back to the Chickasaw Park since that night. I never plan on going back there ever again. A word of warning: be careful where you camp. You never know what you might come across. You might not believe what I have written, but it did happen, and it happened to me. Thank you for taking the time to read this, and if anybody may know what the creature could have been, comments are very welcome. If anybody might know what it was that caused me to have the rage that I had felt come over me, that anger that I felt coming through, are definitely welcome. As soon as I get the chance, I will write some more of my experiences. Thank you. My apologies if it sounds like I'm rambling. I've never typed out an entry this long, and I'm trying to get my thoughts straight. My husband and I had weird simultaneous events last night, and I just wanted to share and see what can be made of it. It should be noted that neither of us have any history of night terrors, sleep paralysis, or anything of that sort, so this sticks out to us as abnormal. I had personally been sleeping a little restlessly all night leading up to this. I just couldn't seem to get comfortable, and I don't know if that's significant or not. Anyway, around 4 a.m., I remember opening my eyes and feeling a sense of dread, and was pulled to look at her bedroom door. Out the door you can see a top of our staircase and a bit of the hallway. When I looked there, I saw a black figure with a white face. It was slowly coming up the stairs and turned to look at me. I initially thought someone had broken in, but my animals weren't freaking out or being abnormal, as they normally are when any person is in the house. What struck me as odd, though, was that I couldn't breathe and felt a heavy feeling on my chest. I know these are symptoms of sleep paralysis. The figure quickly glided across the room and to the side of my bed. During this time, I was rationalizing it away as sleep paralysis while still trying to wake up my husband to help me. During the time, the figure was in my room. My husband had made some sort of noise, and I thought this was in response to me trying to wake him. Fast forward to this morning. I wake up and tell him that I want to tell him about the weird dream that I had. He looked a little shocked and said he had a weird experience last night as well. So I asked him to share with me. And when he told me what had happened, all of my rationalization flew out the window. He said that he woke up with a feeling of terror and unease, unlike anything he's ever felt before. And upon opening his eyes, he saw a cloaked figure with a white face in the room. At this point, he realized he couldn't move and could barely breathe, and he had gasped loudly from the shock, which was the sound I heard coming from him. While we were telling ourselves that it was a weird sleep paralysis event, it was really bizarre that it occurred for the first time for both of us, at the exact same time, and we saw the same thing. A little backstory. I was born on October 31st, 1983. I don't know how much of this is true, but from what I was told, a tornado hit the hospital the moment I was born. It destroyed everything except the NICU and maternity ward. Fast forward a year and a half, I hadn't started really talking yet, and my mom was getting ready for work. I was sitting on the floor playing with my G.I. Joe action figures. As she passes by me, I said, "Mama, don't go." She stopped dead in her tracks. I haven't even said my first word yet, and I just spoke a complete sentence. She looked at me and asked, "What did you say?" Clearly stunned by the situation. I answered her again, "Mama, don't go." With that, she called into work sick. A half hour later, a breaking news report came on the TV. On the highway she would have been driving on, at the same time she would have been driving on it, there was a 13-car pileup. My mom would have died. She told me I saved her life that day. Now after that, my mom went on a downward spiral. She started doing heavy drugs. One night as she was doing them, I came up out of nowhere and bit her on her arm. She flung me across the room, the back of my head hitting the brick fireplace. She realized what she had done and called an ambulance and the police. She turned herself in, and they put her in the psych ward. I was placed with my grandmother. My father wasn't in the picture at that time. My mom and him had been separated since I was 10 months old. He had went into a drunken, drug-induced rage, and because I had been crying, had tried to suffocate me in my crib. My mom fought him off, snatched me up, and took off to her mother's. My grandmother, who I was left with when she was committed. When the family had come back to my house to get our belongings, he was long gone. Now I had just turned 2 living with my grandmother, with my mother in the hospital, when my dad showed up to her house with a new woman on his arm wanting to see me. My grandmother allowed it. She stepped out of the room for a minute to get something, and when she returned, my dad, the woman, and I were all gone. Now this was long before they had the Amber Alert, so my mother's side of the family wouldn't see me for 12 years. I was on the back of milk cartons, and my aunt had hired a private detective to try to find me. But that's a story for another time. Anyway, fast forward to my 8th birthday. I'd come to love the woman who had been on my dad's arm that day, and called her Mom. She protected me from my father on many occasions when he was in a drunken rage. She had a son named Danny, and I had grown very attached to him. I had come to think of him as more than just a brother. He was like a second father to me. He taught me everything that a father was supposed to teach a daughter. Now I loved him very much, and still to this day I miss him. Needless to say, my attachment and connection to him was very strong. So on the night of my 8th birthday, I had a horrible dream. I was out of my body watching him as he was working on a computer. He heard a noise outside and went to inspect it. Someone was messing with his Harley-Davidson motorcycle. The man noticed my brother, snatched my brother's helmet off his bike, and took off down the street. My brother hopped on his motorcycle and took off after him. At the red light down the street, he tried to stop, and he couldn't. His brakes had been cut, so he swerved, hit the curb, and flew 16 feet in the air. When he landed, his neck landed on the curb. He died instantly. I woke up screaming and crying. My stepmom ran in and asked me what was wrong. I told her about the dream. She told me that it was just that, a dream. Unfortunately, I had that dream once a week until the month before it happened. I had even told my brother about it. He had laughed it off and told me not to worry, that he wasn't going anywhere. The look in his eyes told me something different, though. He had believed me. The day came when I had been in school and I was pulled out of class. My dad drove us to the hospital. Once there, the doctor came in and told us there was nothing they could do. Danny was gone. It had happened exactly as my dream had foretold. I've never forgotten that experience. It still haunts me to this day. I still have premonitions and do what I can to help people who they directly affect. Whether they listen or not is their decision. A word of advice though, if a child comes to you with a reoccurring nightmare, please listen to them. It may just save your life. Thank you for reading this. My name is John, and this happened when I was 10 or 11 years old, so it would be around 1978 or 79. While I was younger, I was involved with the church, and this happened one Sunday morning while I was helping set up for Mass. I was the only one in the building setting up when I heard a loud bang coming from the choir loft at the other end of the building. Curious, I stepped out from where I was and called out, "Hello?" And there was no answer. So I figured that the person just didn't hear me and was just doing what they needed to do in getting ready. I was looking up towards the choir loft to see if I could see the person, and there was no one there. I figured that something had just fallen down and the noise just echoed through the church. I was just going through the normal rational ideas to come up with a reason for what I had just heard. Right then and there, I had a feeling that I wasn't alone. Normally, I wouldn't have minded because I figured that the organist came in early to get ready, but this was different. I had this uneasy feeling that not only was my life in jeopardy, but also my soul. It was a fear that I had never felt before or since. As I was looking up at the choir loft, I couldn't see anyone yet. I could sense there was something up there. It then appeared to me. It was a shapeless and formless figure, and it was exuding or giving off this evil that just penetrated through me like sound would a concert if you were standing too close to the amps. What I felt went way beyond the fight or flight reaction people talk about when faced with a situation like this. I was frozen there, beyond being scared, and my mind didn't process things for a few seconds. Then, all of a sudden, I guess my mind snapped back to reality and I just ran and took off out of the church and stayed there until I saw the priests come out of the rectory and started going over to the church. I didn't realize how far I ran until I started walking back to the church. I had ran about 100 to 150 feet from the church. When the priest had seen me fully dressed to take part in the Mass and seen how freaked out I was, he asked me what had happened. So I told him what happened and what I had seen and felt. He tried to reassure me that it was probably my imagination, that it was an old church and that it might have just been something falling or something mechanical. The thing is that I've been in that building long enough to know the sounds of the mechanical devices when they kick on and off. Another thing is that I know my imagination wouldn't give me that life-threatening feeling or being able to tell that there was something giving off such evil that it reverberated throughout my body. I've always been a skeptical person, even since I was this age, and not only that, I've never let my mind get the better of me. I've never lost my faith in God and His advisory, and I feel that what this one was, some kind of evil spirit or demon, and since that day, whenever I went into the church, I always made sure that there would be someone else there, so that I wouldn't have to come across that thing again. Then again, this would be the first time that I came across something like this, but then again, that's a story for another time. It's because of this situation that I became curious about the paranormal, and yet I still try to rationalize everything. When dealing with a situation like this, I believe that saying, if you rule out the probable, all that remains, however improbable, must be possible.